I'm Mariah Ellison, 32 choir accompanist and youngest daughter of a pastor. The sanctuary was full tight rows of bodies dressed in modest black, murmuring, shuffling, passing tissues. A brass cross reflected candlelight above the altar. The choir stood behind it, robes fluttering like curtains in a storm as they turned pages, cleared throats, whispered harmonies under their breath. I stood in the back. Not because I was late. I had been there before the doors opened, helping set out the water pitchers for the soloists, tuning the piano, checking every microphone, though I knew I wouldn't touch one. But when I walked up the side aisle to the front pews, those reserved for family, I was gently, firmly stopped. "Sorry, ma'am. Family only," said a young usher I didn't recognize. His smile was apologetic, but rehearsed. He wore a suit too big for his frame and carried the laminated seating chart like it was scripture. He didn't know me. "I am family," I said quietly. "Mariah, I'm his daughter." He blinked once, scanned the chart. "Oh, it just says Mr. Ellison's daughters, Charlotte and Gwen." He looked up. "You might want to check with Miss Gwen. She organized the program." Of course she did. I looked past him. Gwen was already seated in the second pew, perfectly composed, her black hat perched like a crown. She glanced back at me once, gave the smallest flick of her fingers, not to wave, to dismiss. So I sat in the last row, where the coughs echoed and the AC vent rattled above. The photo slideshow began. My father's face in black and white as a baby, then as a young seminarian, then with Charlotte, her arm looped through his as they baptized someone in the lake. Gwen holding his Bible on the church steps. No photos of me, not even the one from Vacation Bible School where I painted that giant paper cross and he hugged me with paint on both our hands. That photo used to sit on his nightstand. I don't know when it disappeared. The eulogies came and went. Church elders, old friends, Gwen again. Her voice was steady, eloquent, like always. She talked about legacy, a man of discipline, a man of vision, a man who loved his daughters. Plural, but I was still in the back. And then the choir stood. The final hymn. They began softly. "Come, thou fount of every blessing," rising in three-part harmony. My fingers moved in my lap, muscle memory from the years I spent at that very piano, leading them. Then the next verse began, and I froze. It wasn't in the program. It wasn't an old hymn. It was my song. The one I wrote when I was 17, about longing and doubt, and holding on to faith when it doesn't hold you back. It had never been published. I never gave them permission. Yet they were singing it, soft and slow, a cappella, like a prayer. I heard my own melody echo across the vaulted ceiling, reshaped by their voices, and something in the air changed. People turned in their seats. Gwen's head snapped up. Charlotte leaned forward. And then, from the side door of the altar, Bishop Larkin emerged. He was old now, bent and slow, but when he walked to the mic, the choir fell silent. "I'd like to close with a few words," he said. Then he turned toward the choir. "That song you just heard was composed by Mariah Ellison, youngest daughter of our beloved pastor." Gasps, shifting bodies. A sudden hush fell like dust settling. The entire sanctuary turned to look, and I felt it. The shift. The silence that wasn't emptiness, but recognition. Their eyes found me. The forgotten one. The quiet one. If you've ever been through something like this, drop a comment or let me know where you're watching from. Hit like or subscribe if family drama ever made you feel invisible too. Bishop Larkin held out his hand. "Mariah, child, come forward." I rose, and the whispering stopped. I didn't remember walking down the aisle. My feet moved, but I was floating somewhere behind them, above the pews, where the air smelled of lilies and wood polish and powdered perfume. People leaned back as I passed, their faces uncertain, like they were trying to place me in a photo that had faded too long ago. Gwen's mouth was tight. Charlotte blinked as if she couldn't quite process what was happening. She made a small motion with her hand, as if to pull me beside her in the pew, but it was too late. Bishop Larkin was already guiding me to the front, his fingers gentle on my elbow, his voice a low hush as he said, "Come stand by the piano. Mariah, let them see you." The choir parted slightly, like a tide easing open. I stood beside the piano bench I used to claim every Sunday morning, back when I still believed that playing for God would earn me a seat at my father's table. And I looked out at them, the sanctuary, my father's flock. Some nodded slowly. One or two clasped their hands to their mouths. A woman from the alto section whispered. She was always the quiet one. Bishop Larkin raised his hand again. Many of you may not know that this young woman, this gifted, faithful woman, wrote that song after losing her mother. It was the first song she ever shared with her father. He told me once it was the most honest expression of grief he'd ever heard. I blinked. I hadn't known he said that. He kept the sheet music in his Bible, the bishop added. And when I asked Gwen if we could honor that piece today, she agreed. Thank you. Gwen. She didn't look up. Applause began, not thunderous, but gentle, careful, as if afraid to break something too delicate. It didn't feel like vindication. It felt like air rushing into a room where I'd held my breath for 15 years. After the service, I slipped out before the reception began. I didn't want cake or casseroles or long hugs from women who still called me baby girl. I ducked through the side hallway, where the old bulletin board still listed choir practice times in faded ink. Behind me, footsteps followed. Mariah. I turned. Charlotte approached, heels clicking like accusation. Her funeral hat had slipped back, revealing graying temples she'd once dyed religiously. I didn't know they were going to do that, she said quickly. The song. Gwen didn't tell me. I'm not mad about the song. I said, well, people are talking now. That was unexpected. A surprise, I guess. It wasn't meant to be a surprise. It was supposed to be a gift. For Dad. When I gave it to him, Charlotte looked away. He never played it for us. Of course he didn't. I thought you moved on, she said. With your music. With your life. I thought you didn't want any of this anymore. You thought wrong, I said, and started to walk away. She followed. Wait, you weren't even at the hospital when he died. That's why Gwen didn't. I stopped walking. Because no one told me. I said flatly, I found out through the church bulletin. Online. She stared. What? No call. No text. Not from Gwen. Not from you. Charlotte took a step back, as if I'd struck her. Her hands rose slightly in that old defensive posture, the one she used when we fought as kids, and she'd start crying before I even finished my sentence. I thought you were in Chicago, she mumbled. I didn't have your new number. You didn't ask. She looked down. We stood there for a long moment, between the hymn board and the coat rack, surrounded by other people's shoes and umbrellas. Then she said softly, he did talk about you. Sometimes. At night, when he thought we were asleep. I think he missed you more than he knew how to say. It wasn't an apology, but it was close enough. I nodded and walked away. This time she didn't follow. The next week, I went back to my apartment and unpacked the folder I'd hidden in the back of my closet. It was the one I hadn't opened since college. Inside, 10 sheets of original music, including the song they'd sung at the funeral, a photo of me and Dad, both in choir robes, with his hand on my shoulder. A letter he wrote the year I turned 21, but never mailed. I had found it tucked inside a hymnal I took home from church the week after I moved out. It was dated February 6th. My birthday. Mariah, I heard your piece last night. The one you sent through that music professor. I couldn't speak afterward. I just sat on the edge of the bed and let it echo. I don't know how you wrote that. How something so still can carry so much pain. It made me see things I didn't want to see. Maybe I haven't been fair to you. You're not like the others. And maybe I've made you feel small because I didn't know how to love you big, but I see you now. I hope someday you'll come home and play it again this time, with me listening. Love. Dad. I had never told anyone about that letter. Not Gwen, not Charlotte, not even the professor who passed it along. A few weeks later, I was asked to return to the church not to perform, but to teach. They wanted to start a youth composition class, music theory and spiritual expression. The bishop said they'd pay me hourly. At first, I declined. Then I passed by the sanctuary one evening while a teen choir was practicing. They were struggling with tempo, one boy too fast, another dragging behind. I stood outside the door. The music was broken, uneven, but brave. That sound. It was the sound of someone trying. I stepped inside. Try it again, I said. But this time, feel the rhythm in your chest before you count it out loud. The girl at the piano looked startled, then nodded. They tried again. It sounded better. That's when I said yes. On the first day of class, one of the girls asked if I could play them the funeral song. I heard it was yours, she said shyly. It's all over TikTok now. Someone recorded it? I laughed. TikTok? Huh. She nodded. It's called Still. I Stay. That's what everyone calls it. That wasn't its title, but maybe it was now. I played it slowly, the chords softer than before, the melody shaped by time and grief, and the strange redemption of being heard too late, but still heard. When I looked up, a few of them had tears in their eyes. So did I. Outside the church, Gwen finally called me, not to apologize, just to say, Dad left the piano to you. It's in the will. Said it was always yours anyway. I didn't answer right away. Then thanks for telling me. He loved you. You know, she said quietly. I know. I replied. I just wish he'd said it sooner. So do I. The day they delivered the piano to my apartment, I cleared space in the corner beside the window. The keys were still tuned, the wood still polished. Inside the bench was the old hymnal, and tucked inside it, one last folded note. Sing even if they don't listen. Play even if they don't ask. Some songs are only understood after the silence. The first week with the piano felt like living with a ghost that didn't haunt me, just watched. I'd wake up, pour coffee, and catch myself walking over, like it was a person I needed to greet. Sometimes, I'd sit without touching the keys, just stare at the grain of the wood. My father's initials were scratched faintly on the side from when he was a boy. J.E., Joseph Ellison. Etched in a moment he probably forgot as soon as he did it. But I traced it with my finger like it was holy. I didn't play for a few days. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know what would come out. It had been years since I'd written anything that wasn't for someone else. Church programs, wedding processionals, student exercises, they were clean and neat and necessary. But this piano, this bench, they weren't asking for structure. They were asking for truth. And truth was messy. Then one evening, after class, one of my students, a boy named Mason, asked me if I had ever written something out of anger. I blinked. What kind of anger? He shrugged. Like, when someone talks over you, or acts like you're not there. That kind of mad. I felt something tighten in my chest. Yeah, I said. I've written from that kind of mad. Can we write like that? He asked. For next week's assignment, I looked at him. He was all elbows and buzz cut and unspoken feelings. His jaw clenched when he talked about his mom. He played chords like he was pounding them into the ground. Yes, I said. Next week. Bring me your anger. All of it. Don't clean it up. He smiled for the first time since joining class. That night, I finally sat at the piano and played. Not my funeral song, not a hymn, just notes that hurt. They came out crooked, uneven, like a wound learning to walk. I didn't write them down. I didn't need to. They weren't for anyone else. Not yet. Gwen showed up unannounced the following Saturday. She knocked like she was late for something. 3 fast raps, then 1 soft. The way she used to knock on my bedroom door before demanding I lend her a sweater. I opened the door slowly. Wow, she said. You're actually here. Where else would I be? She held up a plastic container. I brought carrot cake. Your favorite. It was Dad's favorite. I hated carrot cake. I let her in anyway. She stepped inside and looked around. Her eyes went straight to the piano. So that's the one. I nodded. She didn't sit. Instead, she walked over to the bookshelf where I kept some old sheet music, a dusty metronome, and a few of Dad's theology books I hadn't had the heart to donate. She reached out, picked up one of the books, The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis, and turned it over in her hands. He read that one before Mom died, I said quietly. Gwen didn't reply. She just set it down again and folded her arms. Finally, she said, Do you remember the night of your graduation concert from college? She nodded. I blinked. Yeah, of course. Why Dad didn't come? But I did. I know. I saw you. She hesitated. He was going to come. He bought a train ticket. I found it in his desk later, folded inside the program from your first recital. I didn't know what to say. I think he was scared. She went on. Scared he couldn't face what he'd ignored. Scared he'd see too much of Mom in you and not enough of himself. I swallowed. The piano behind me seemed to hold its breath. I should have told you sooner, she said. But we were all hurting. And I thought, maybe if I stayed quiet, it would hurt less. It didn't. I said. I know. We stood there for a long time, both quiet, both still. Then she said, Can I hear you play something? I hesitated. She added, Just one song. Any song. So I sat down and played Still. I Stay. The way I meant it to sound. The way I used to play it late at night in my college practice room, when no one else was listening. I slowed it down. Let the dissonance linger longer than the sheet music allowed. Held the silence after the last note just a few seconds longer. When I turned around, Gwen had tears in her eyes. She didn't wipe them away. She just nodded, whispered, Thank you, and quietly left. Weeks passed. The youth class grew. Mason brought 3 friends. One girl started composing songs for her sister's TikTok channel. Another wrote a jazz riff that made the bishop tap his foot and grin like a child. The quiet ones gravitated toward me. The kids who didn't raise their hands. The ones who mumbled their lyrics and scribbled notes in pencil and erased them 100 times before sharing. I saw myself in them. Heard old echoes in the way they paused before the chorus. And slowly, something softened inside me, one afternoon, after class. I found a note in the donation box at the church door. It wasn't signed. It read, Your song said what I couldn't. I lost my brother last year and never cried until that day. Thank you for letting silence sing. I folded the note carefully and tucked it into my coat pocket. Later, I placed it in the hymnal beside Dad's letter. Charlotte called next. She invited me to brunch. Just us. No church. No funeral flowers. We met at a tiny place off Main Street with chipped plates and strong coffee. She showed up in jeans, which was rare, and hugged me before we sat down. "I've been reading about you," she said, pulling out her phone. "You're on the church blog. The kids call you Miss M." I smiled. "Better than that Ellison girl." She laughed. "I'm glad you're back," she said. "It feels like the family is starting to breathe again." I looked at her, searching for sarcasm, but found none. "You always made space for us," I said, "even when Dad didn't." Her smile faltered. "I tried. But I should have done more. I should have asked if you were okay. I shouldn't have let Gwen decide who belonged." "You're here now," I said. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Don't disappear again." "I won't." And I meant it. That night, I wrote a new piece. It didn't have a title. Not yet. But it had warmth. Lift. It didn't ache like the old ones. The melody started with a single, low note, then a soft harmony above it, like two sisters walking side by side, one slightly ahead, the other finally catching up. I played it 3 times before recording a demo on my phone. Then I sent it to Gwen. No message. No caption. Just the audio. She replied 4 minutes later, 3 words. "Write more. Please." The email came on a rainy Thursday, tucked between spam messages and a music store coupon I never used. The subject line was simple: "Invitation to submit local composer spotlight." I nearly deleted it. Thought it was a mass email. But the sender was real. Olivia Jameson, music director at the city's largest performing arts center. She had apparently heard my piece. Still, I stay through a viral TikTok duet one of my students had posted. The video had over 300,000 views now. A boy with nervous eyes and a girl with a voice like smoke sang it together in a stairwell. The caption had read, "She wrote this after being ignored at her dad's funeral. We all felt it." Olivia wrote, "We're curating an evening of local, original works performed live by chamber orchestra. We'd love to feature a new composition from you. No pressure, but if you're open to it, we'd be honored." I reread the message 3 times before I believed it was real. Then I stared at the blinking cursor in the reply box. What could I possibly write that belonged in a theater with velvet seats and stage lights? Still, my hands moved. Yes, I'd be honored. "I'll submit something by the end of the month." And then I sat back and whispered to myself, "You better mean that." I didn't tell Gwen or Charlotte right away. I didn't tell the students either. It felt too fragile, like speaking it aloud would chase it away. But I knew what I wanted the piece to be. Not about grief. Not this time. This time, I wanted it to be about presence. That quiet but defiant presence of the ones no one sees until they do something unforgettable. The people who hold the notes under the melody, who tune the instruments before the show, who write songs from back pews. I titled it "The Second Daughter," and for the first time in years, I composed without apology. The process took weeks. I spent late nights hunched over my keyboard, scribbling out measures, correcting timing, layering harmonies until they rang true. Some parts were tender, like a hand reaching toward a closed door. Others punched like a heartbeat that refused to stop, no matter who ignored it. One afternoon, after 3 hours of rewriting a bridge section, I stopped, leaned back, and laughed. Not out of joy, but out of disbelief. The notes sounded like me, not my father, not the church, not the family version of me that Gwen used to curate like a photo album. Just me, Mariah, with the quiet voice and the loud music. I sent the finished score to Olivia on the 1st of the month. She replied within the hour, "Beautiful, bold. Rehearsals begin in 3 weeks." Will you introduce the piece yourself? I froze. Introduce it. Me on stage. I practiced what I might say in the mirror. Hi. I'm Mariah Ellison. This piece is for anyone who was ever left out of the photo, but still showed up to sing. Too bitter. This is dedicated to the ones who stayed when no one asked them to. Too sad. In the end, I kept it simple. I wrote this as a way back. Back to myself. And maybe, for someone out there, it can be a way forward too. Gwen surprised me again the week before the performance. She showed up at my door with a flat box wrapped in cream paper and a ribbon. Found this in Dad's closet, she said. I wasn't sure you'd want it. I opened it slowly. Inside was an old choir robe. Mine. It still smelled faintly of cedarwood and candle wax. On the inner lining, in black marker, was my name Maria. Underneath it, in my father's handwriting, was something I hadn't seen before. My songbird. I closed the lid carefully and held it to my chest. Thank you, I whispered. The night of the performance, I wore black slacks, a fitted blouse, and no makeup except a swipe of lipstick Charlotte insisted on applying herself. You're going to be in the program, she said. Better look like someone who matters. I already do. I smiled. She grinned back and looped her arm through mine. Damn right. The venue was grand in a way that made my throat dry. Plush chairs, gold filigree, musicians tuning string instruments under soft lights. My name was printed on the third line of the program beneath new works by emerging voices when they announced me. I walked on stage slowly, heart hammering. The audience was a blur of shadow and silk. I stood behind the mic, and I said I used to think silence meant I didn't belong, but sometimes silence is just the space where music waits to be heard. Then I stepped aside. The conductor lifted her hand, and the orchestra played. It was different. Hearing someone else bring my music to life, there was power in it, precision. Even the smallest rests felt intentional. When the final note fell away, the room stayed quiet for a full beat. Then applause. Loud. Real. And I saw them. Gwen, Charlotte, Bishop Larkin, Mason and the other kids from class, even the usher from the funeral, sitting in the very back, clapping. But my eyes found one empty seat in the third row, right side. It was where Dad would have sat. I imagined him there, fingers folded, that slight nod he always gave when something moved him. I didn't cry. Not that night. Instead, I bowed and walked off stage, into the light. Afterward, people shook my hand, thanked me, asked where they could hear more. A young woman pressed a slip of paper into my hand with her email. I'd love to collaborate, she said. Your sound is honest. Gwen hugged me with both arms. Charlotte cried openly. I'm proud of you, she said. We both are. I didn't correct her. Let her speak for Gwen, too. Sometimes. That's enough. The next day, I taught class as usual. No one asked about the concert. Maybe they didn't know. Or maybe they knew and didn't need to say anything. But Mason stayed behind after everyone left. I watched the live stream. He said, "That was your real voice, wasn't it?" I nodded. He pulled a folded paper from his bag. I wrote this. It's not finished, but it's the first thing that sounds like me. I opened it. It was rough, but it pulsed. There was a heartbeat in the rests. You're getting close, I said. He smiled. Thanks for seeing me. I always did. Later that night, I played my father's favorite hymn, Be Still, my soul on the piano, slowly, thoughtfully. I didn't rush it, didn't weep through it, just played it as if someone might be listening. And maybe someone was. I started hearing from people I hadn't thought about in years. emails, messages, even 2 handwritten letters. One was from an old music teacher, Miss Claridge, who had taught me chords when I was 10. She'd heard about the performance through her niece, who lived in the city. "You always played like you were keeping something sacred," she wrote. "Now I know what it was." The other was from a woman named Elsie. I didn't recognize the name at first, but her note brought it back. "We met at your mom's wake. You were standing near the punch bowl, humming something. I asked what it was, and you said, 'Just a song I haven't finished yet.'" I never forgot that. She had enclosed a pressed flower from her garden, lavender. That was the flower I'd tucked into the folds of Mom's hymn book the day we buried her. It had to be 20 years ago. These things, these tiny, buried threads, were pulling themselves to the surface now, and I didn't know whether to feel honored or haunted. 2 weeks after the concert, Bishop Larkin called me into his office. The building hadn't changed in 30 years. Flickering lights in the hallway, brown carpet, framed scripture on the walls with cracked glass. He poured tea into mismatched mugs and slid one across the desk. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "You've brought life back to the music ministry, not just in the choir, in the silence too." I tilted my head. "In the silence," he smiled. "You gave the quiet ones a language. That's holy work, even if it doesn't show up in the bulletin." Then he cleared his throat. "Which is why I want to ask, would you consider being the church's official composer in residence?" I blinked. "Is that a thing?" "It is now," he said, grinning. "I don't think I'm qualified." "You're more than qualified." I thought of my father, of Gwen, of all the Sundays I'd spent wondering if I'd ever be seen. And now, here I was, being asked to stay, to create, to belong. "I'll think about it," I said, and I meant that too. I walked home through the side street that ran along the old part of town. The shops were mostly closed, but the bookstore had left its front light on, illuminating a window display of poetry collections. One caught my eye, the ones they almost forgot. I stepped closer. It was a book of poems by a local author. The cover was simple cream paper, black font, no blurbs. But it looked like something that didn't beg to be noticed, just existed anyway. I bought it, walked home holding it like it was something fragile. That night, I read one of the poems out loud. Then, almost without thinking, I set it to music. The melody came quick, like it had been waiting. By morning, I had a new song. When I told Gwen about the offer from Bishop Larkin, she didn't hesitate. "Take it," she said. "You've already been doing the job for years." I laughed. "I think the job used to be Dad's." She looked at me. "Dad taught doctrine. You're teaching expression, different callings." I was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you think he'd be proud she didn't look away?" I know he would. Sunday came, and with it, a new service order. I'd been asked to compose an original benediction, a short piece to close the service in place of the usual, "Go now in peace." I wrote something called "After the Amen." It was simple, 3 voices, echoing one another, then resolving into unison on the last word. As the final chord faded, I opened my eyes and saw people still standing still. No rush to leave, no coughing, no rustling coats, just stillness, as if the silence was the most sacred part of all. I visited Dad's grave later that week. I hadn't been in a while. The stone was clean. Someone had left a single lily beside it. Maybe Charlotte. Maybe Gwen. I knelt and placed a folded page at the base of the marker. Sheet music. The final version of the second daughter. Then I sat cross-legged in the grass and whispered, "You didn't hear me then, but they do now, and maybe that's enough." The wind picked up. Leaves rustled. Somewhere behind me. A bell rang. Back at the church. Mason surprised me. I want to play something at next month's youth showcase, he said. But I want it to be mine, not anyone else's song. Mine. He looked nervous, but determined. I nodded. Good. I'll help you get it ready. He paused, then added, Do you ever get scared that they'll stop listening all the time? I wanted to say, but instead, I said, Sometimes they do. But if the song is true, someone always hears it, even if it's later. He smiled. I think you're right. I told Bishop Larkin I'd accept the position. He clapped his hands together like a delighted child and said, I knew you'd say yes. And then I want you to write the Easter cantata this year. All of it. I nearly choked on my tea. Are you serious as a resurrection? He grinned. I laughed, then nodded. I'll start this week. He leaned in, voice lower. Make it different. Make it real. Let the shadows stay in the story. I knew exactly what he meant. On the way home, I passed a group of teens practicing harmonies on the church steps. They weren't singing anything official, just playing around. One boy beatboxed, another rapped something silly. But in the middle of the chaos, one girl sang a phrase from Still, I Stay, and they all stopped. Yo, that's the funeral song. Someone said, No, that's Miss M's song. They turned and saw me. Hey, the girl called. We were just talking about you. I waved. Sounds like you were singing about me too. They laughed. And for the first time, I realized I was part of the sound now, not just the silence. That evening, I wrote the first movement of the cantata. I titled it Stone Rolled Back. It began not with triumph but with breath, a single held note, barely audible, then slowly, layer by layer, it opened, like a mouth learning to speak after years of holding sorrow in its teeth. The first time I heard the cantata rehearsed out loud, I didn't sit in the front. I took my old seat near the back pew, notebook in hand, pen tucked behind my ear like always. The choir was mixed that day, half adult, half youth. Some read notes confidently, others stumbled. A boy in the tenor section cracked during a high phrase and muttered, Sorry, under his breath. The girl beside him patted his shoulder and said, That note's tough. You'll get it. It was messy, unpolished, honest. I loved it immediately. The sanctuary wasn't full, but it didn't need to be. The sound moved anyway, the way breath carries in an empty room when you don't expect it to. The first piece, Stone Rolled Back, began with 3 measures of silence. I watched as the singers leaned into it. Not just paused, but leaned. That was what I had been trying to teach them all year. That silence wasn't absence. It was presence, waiting to be heard. The choir director, Mrs. Langford, came over to me after the final chord rang out. She looked at me with misted eyes and said, I've sung 1,000 Easter songs, but this felt like the silence before the tomb opened. You gave us that space. I smiled. Thank you for trusting it. She pressed her hand to my arm. We need more music like this. That night, I went home and opened my father's old folder of handwritten sermons. I hadn't touched them in years. Inside, I found a page marked Easter morning, unfinished. There was no full sermon, just a single line at the top of the paper. Some things resurrect quietly. No underline, no commentary. Just that. I stared at it for a long time. Then I pulled out my composition journal and wrote that line across the first page of the next piece. That would be the name of Movement 2. The week before the cantata premiere, Olivia Jameson invited me to a small composers panel downtown. It was part of a local arts initiative, 5 musicians, 1 hour, and a room full of strangers. We sat on folding chairs in front of an audience that had more coffee cups than notepads. No one looked like they were here for anything more than polite listening. Then someone asked, "What was the moment you realized your work mattered?" The room got quiet. I could have said the funeral. I could have said the performance at the theater. But I thought of Mason, of the girl humming on the church steps, of Gwen silently crying on my couch while I played the song she'd tried to keep from the service. So I said, "When someone else sings your pain, and it sounds like healing." A woman in the second row wiped her cheek. No one clapped. They didn't need to. The morning of the premiere, the church filled early. I arrived before sunrise, carrying a thermos of tea and a folder full of last-minute changes I didn't actually need to make. I sat alone at the piano for a few minutes before anyone came in. I played a scale, then a chord, then the opening note. It didn't echo the way I remembered. It filled the room differently now, like the space had rearranged itself to fit the music. Gwen slipped in quietly and sat beside me. She didn't speak. She just handed me a folded paper. Inside was a printed photo. Me, Gwen, Charlotte, and Dad. Easter Sunday, 20 years ago. We were all in pastels, arms looped together. On the back, she had written, "He loved you." Even when he failed to say it, I didn't cry. I just held it tight in my hand. The cantata began with no introduction, no grand gesture, just voices, rising slow, breaking open. The crowd leaned forward. Some closed their eyes. In movement to two, there was a solo I'd written for one of the younger girls, Eliza. She was shy, always too soft during practice. But this time, she found her note. She held it long, and people stopped breathing. It wasn't about pitch or polish. It was raw, beautiful. After the final movement after the stone, the church fell silent. No one rushed to clap. They sat still, like they'd just seen something come back to life. Afterward, as I gathered my papers, a woman approached me, middle-aged, soft-spoken, wearing a blue scarf that looked handmade. She said, "My daughter died 5 years ago. I haven't sung since." I nodded gently. She added, "But today, during your cantata, I remembered what it felt like to be full, not fixed, just full." She reached into her purse and handed me a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this during the silence. I don't know if it's anything, but maybe you can make it something." I opened it later. It was a poem. 4 lines. She wasn't loud, but she stayed. Now I hum her name like a hymn I forgot I knew. I kept it. That would become Movement Fou. The following week, I finally visited Charlotte's house. She'd been asking for weeks. When I walked in, the walls were covered in framed family photos. Her daughters, graduation photos, her husband standing proudly beside a grill. But on the piano in the corner was something different. A photo of me. From the performance. Mid-bow. I pointed. "Where'd you get this?" She smiled. "Gwen took it. Sent me a print. She's not big on sharing." Charlotte shrugged. "She's learning." We drank coffee and talked about old church gossip, terrible casseroles, and who used to sneak snacks behind the choir loft. Then Charlotte said something I didn't expect. "I used to think you were okay being quiet, that you didn't need much." I said nothing. She continued, "But now I know you weren't quiet. You were waiting." She looked at me, "And I'm sorry it took us this long to hear you." I nodded. "Some songs," I said softly, "need time." Later, I walked past the sanctuary and heard 2 young girls playing a clumsy version of Still. I stay on the piano, laughing when they hit the wrong notes, trying again, laughing again. I didn't interrupt. I just stood in the doorway and listened. They were rewriting it with joy. It felt right. That night, I wrote my final movement, Movement V, they sang her song. It was based on that moment, those two girls. The sound of something old being made new again, not with precision, but with belonging. I ended the score with a note. For the ones who didn't ask for a microphone only a moment. Spring settled in slowly, as if it, too, was afraid of being too loud. Dogwood trees bloomed along the walkways behind the church, petals floating like pieces of torn paper. The sky was always just a little overcast, like it hadn't quite decided whether to open up or close off. It matched how I felt most mornings, restless, full, waiting. My students noticed the shift in me, not with words, with eyes. They'd glance at me longer, linger near the piano even after class ended. I didn't have to tell them I was working on something new. They could feel it. One afternoon, Mason approached me after class. His hands were covered in graphite from his music notebook. Lines smudged across his palms. "I finished it," he said. "Your piece." He nodded. "I'm gonna play it at the youth recital." "What's it called?" He shrugged, still thinking. "But it's about my mom. How she never hears me the first time. But I keep saying things anyway." I smiled. "That's a song." He grinned. "It kinda sounds like your stuff." "Good." "No, I mean, like, really sounds like it. Like you rubbed off on me." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's how music works. It lingers in people." He looked proud, not big and flashy, just quietly proud. I knew that feeling. Later that week, I got a message from Olivia again. She wanted to commission another piece, nothing big. She said, "Just a solo work, something for voice and cello. We're planning a night themed around personal truths." She asked if I had anything in progress. I did. I just hadn't named it yet. It was the one I started after hearing those two girls clumsily play my funeral song. I'd written it in bits between classes, over breakfast, late at night when I should have been sleeping. It was the gentlest thing I'd written since college. No dramatic crescendos. Just movement. Like water. Like breath. I emailed her the sheet music without fanfare. The subject line simply read, "For when someone finally listens." The following Sunday, I stayed after service to help rearrange the sanctuary chairs. There was going to be a wedding later that afternoon, one of the youth choir girls. Barely 20, radiant and nervous. She'd asked me to play piano for the ceremony. I'd said yes before she finished asking. When the rehearsal ended and most people had left, I sat at the piano and played one of my earliest compositions, Not Still, I Stay, not the cantata, one even older. A piece I wrote when I was 16, before the grief, before the silence. It was bright, curious, full of questions. It felt strange now, like reading a journal entry from someone who used to be me, but wasn't anymore. Charlotte walked in halfway through. She waited by the door, arms crossed, smiling like she was watching someone dance in their sleep. "That one sounds familiar," she said. "I used to play it on repeat. Drove Dad crazy." He never said that. Not out loud. She walked over, picked up a chair, and sat beside me. For a moment, we said nothing. Then she said, "I've been writing, really, yeah. Not songs, just letters. To Mom, to Dad, to you. Sometimes." I turned slightly toward her. "Letters you send." She shook her head. "Not yet." I smiled. "They still count." She looked at me then, eyes soft. I think I wanted to be loud so no one would forget me, but maybe I just needed to listen more. We sat there for a long time, the old piano between us like a bridge we were finally willing to cross. That night, I dreamt of my father. We were in the sanctuary, but it was empty. Just us. He sat in the front row, Bible open on his lap, head bowed like he was listening. I sat at the piano, played the song I never got to play for him. When I finished, he didn't clap. He just looked up and said, "That's what I meant." I didn't understand. I still don't. But it stayed with me all the next day. The youth recital came fast. We held it in the fellowship hall, folding chairs, twinkle lights, a table of cookies and juice that someone's mom overdecorated with glitter napkins. But the music was sacred. One by one, they performed, some with trembling hands, some with voices that cracked mid-note, but none of them held back. They played like it mattered, because it did. Mason was last. He didn't introduce his piece, just sat at the keyboard, nodded at me once, then began. The melody was sparse, slow, a pattern of 3 notes followed by silence. Then again. Each round louder, more insistent. Then suddenly, it broke open fast, panicked, emotional, and collapsed into a single held chord. The room was dead silent when he lifted his hands, then thunderous applause. I walked up to him afterward and whispered, "You named it yet?" He nodded. "It's called Say It Again." My throat closed. I just hugged him. That night, I added a line to my journal. Sometimes, teaching someone to sing is the loudest song you'll ever write. A week later, Gwen sent me a text. Dinner. My place. No occasion. Just us. I almost said no. I still carried old pieces of that silence between us, but I typed, "Yes. I'll bring dessert." She replied, "Don't bring carrot cake. I finally admit it's disgusting." I laughed out loud. Dinner was easy, not perfect, not polished, but warm. We talked about everything but the past. Books, music, her cat, a new church intern who reminded her of Charlotte's rebellious phase. We cleaned dishes together. She poured tea. As we sat in her living room, she said, "Do you ever think about leaving, like, moving away? Starting fresh somewhere new?" I shook my head. This town still has too much of me in it. Too much history, too much unfinished music. She nodded. "Yeah, I get that." Before I left, she hugged me at the door. "I'm glad you stayed," she whispered. "Me too," I thought. But I didn't say it. Some things sound better unsaid. When I got home, I opened the piano bench to grab an old chord sheet. Instead, I found a small envelope, tucked under a hymnal. My name was on it, my father's handwriting. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. "Mariah, by now you know silence was my first language, but I hope music became yours because I never learned how to say things out loud. If you're reading this, then maybe you stayed long enough to be heard. And if they sing your song, remember there was never a day I didn't know it came from you. Love, Dad." I folded it slowly, laid it inside my journal, then turned on the piano lamp, took a breath, and began to write. The last song I wrote for the church wasn't for a service, it wasn't for Easter, or a funeral, or the youth recital. It was for a Sunday afternoon that felt like nothing special, just wind in the trees and laughter drifting in from the children's choir room. I had stayed behind after class, waiting for the janitor to finish mopping the front vestibule, when I found myself humming something. Not familiar, not structured, just there. I moved to the piano and played the melody. Simple, circular, no grand entrance, just a phrase that came and returned, like breath, like memory. I wrote it down on the back of a leftover bulletin, titled it, "She Stayed." No explanation, no dedication. It was just a song. A few weeks later, Olivia emailed again. Her message was short this time. "People keep asking when you're releasing something. Are you ready to let the world hear you?" I stared at those words for a long time. Was I I'd spent most of my life playing behind curtains, in back pews, in the quiet shadows of other people's voices. My work wasn't polished. It wasn't meant for charts or awards. It was built in silence, in grief, in half sentences and missed calls. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the world needed music that didn't try to shout over the noise, just slipped beneath it and held on. So I sent her a file, 10 songs, a small, quiet album titled The Ones Who Stayed. She replied within hours. It's stunning. Let's release it in the fall. When the announcement went live, Gwen called me immediately. You didn't tell me. I wasn't sure you'd care. She snorted. Of course I care. You're my sister. That hasn't always meant what it should. No, she said quietly, but I'm learning. She paused, then added, I pre-ordered it, twice. The church started asking if I would teach adults too. At first, I wasn't sure. Grown-ups carried so much shame about their creativity. Kids sang without worrying how they sounded. Adults apologized before they even opened their mouths. But I said yes. The first class was awkward. A group of 5, 1 retired teacher, 1 florist, 2 church deacons, and a woman who used to sell insurance but now just wanted to write lullabies for her grandkids. We started with humming, then one-syllable melodies, then shared lyrics. By the 3rd week, they stopped apologizing. By the 5th, they started singing over each other. And I realized sometimes silence isn't pain. It's just someone waiting to be asked. The day the album launched, I didn't throw a party. I didn't post about it. I didn't even tell most of my friends. Instead, I went to the church early, sat in the sanctuary, alone, played every song live on the old upright piano, just for me. No microphones, no reverb, just fingers on keys, soft air, creaking pedals, and morning light pouring through stained glass. The album wasn't for the ones who'd never forgotten me. It was for the ones who'd never known me in the first place and still listened. It was for Mason, for Eliza, for the woman who lost her daughter and wrote 4 lines of poetry during a cantata. It was for the girl who never got a front pew, but whose song was sung anyway. It was for me. A few weeks later, I was walking to the corner grocery when a young woman tapped me on the shoulder. You're Mariah Ellison. Right. I hesitated. Yes. She beamed. You wrote, Say It Again. I blinked. That was Mason's piece. I know. But he says you taught him everything. I laughed. He gives me too much credit. She shook her head. It changed how I listen, made me want to write something of my own. I smiled, then write it, even if no one listens at first. She nodded and walked away. And I stood there for a moment, stunned. Not because she recognized me, but because she repeated my words back to me, like a song. One quiet Tuesday, Charlotte invited me to her home for tea. Just us again. We sat in the sunroom. She had music playing softly in the background, my album. Track 3, Dust on the Frame, the one I wrote after finding the photo of all 4 of us. Arms linked in pastels. She didn't say anything about it, just poured tea. Then she handed me a small box, wrapped in a scarf. No card. I opened it slowly. Inside was Mom's hymn book, the one with the lavender pressed inside. I found it in a drawer last week, she said. Didn't even know I had it. Thought you should keep it. I traced my hand across the cover. The leather was cracked at the spine, the corners soft with age. When I opened it, the flower was still there, faded, fragile, but whole. And next to it was a handwritten note. Not Mom's. Charlotte's. I see you now. I closed the book and looked at her. She didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. The last concert of the season came in late October. We held it outdoors, an amphitheater near the lake, leaves falling, wind stirring. The choir wore shawls over their robes. I wore gloves with the fingers cut off so I could still play. Halfway through the program, the conductor turned to the crowd and said, "We'd like to perform a new piece written by our composer in residence, Mariah Ellison." Applause. I sat at the keyboard, the choir behind me, the lake in front of me, and I began to play. She stayed. It had no big ending, just a final note that faded into the trees. As people stood to leave, a little girl ran up to the edge of the stage. She was maybe 6, freckles, pink boots. She tugged on her dad's sleeve and pointed at me. "Daddy, that's the lady from the song." He smiled. "What song?" "The one about the quiet girl." I blinked. She looked right at me. "You sound like someone I dreamed once." Then she turned and ran off laughing, and I sat there, breath caught in my throat, because maybe that's what it meant to be heard. Not fame, not applause, not awards, but being remembered by someone who hadn't even known you yet. Later that night, I walked home with my gloves still on. The stars were out. The street lamps flickered soft, and I passed by the old sanctuary. The lights were off. The pews were empty. But in my mind, I heard them. The voices, the echoes, the girls on the steps, Mason, Gwen, Dad, singing my song. And I smiled. Not big, not proud, just soft, like the silence that comes after a story ends, and you sit still, letting it settle, letting it stay.